Good afternoon, everyone. We are here at the Sala delle Colonne di Ca' Giustinian, the headquarters of the Biennale, to host one of the expanded program sessions for meetings on architecture related to the 17th Architecture Biennale 2021. Thank you all for attending, both in person and online. I understand there are about 100 people and it's rolling online, and there are about 70 people registered in person. Welcome all from all around the world, from all time zones. Very briefly, this particular meeting is around a film that was put together by a group called Sensory Ethnography Labs at Harvard University that consists of Lucien Castin-Taylor and Verena Paravel, both ethnographers, filmmakers, who are very much interested in the connection between ethnography and aesthetics. And their work has broken really significant grounds in rethinking the format of the documentary film. And with films like Cannibal, like Leviathan, their work has received major international recognition and exposure and has been featured in many international film festivals, Berlin, New York, and Venice Biennale included. And their work has also transcended the boundary between film and art and has been included in museums like MoMA, the Whitney Biennale, and Saint-Georges Pompidou. The film that they have put together is a very interesting film of about 20 interviewees where they have gone to them to ask them in a very particular format. Their visual dimension is always very, very stunning. How will we live together? Without their presence, without their voice, just the faces and voices of the luminaries in the world. We made it clear from the beginning that the interviewees should not be architects, but should be people who have been reflecting on the question, how will we live together? And the result is a set of interviews that were carefully edited and orchestrated by the directors in order to allow for a certain dialogue to emerge between the different luminaries without them talking to each other. And the film is 4 hours long. It is being shown constantly in the lower level of the Giardini main room. And it's divided into 3 sections. The section we will be seeing today, this afternoon, is the third. The first section focuses primarily on going deeper into the question and asking if we will ever at all live together. There's a sense of existential questioning there. The second part of the film turns around into much more programmatic visioning about how will we live together, kind of people projecting forward. And then the third section focuses primarily on the biological expanded understanding of who the we are to include other species and beings. And this is the third section today that we will see. It will last about 90 minutes. And the people included in this particular section, I will start with our guest, Emanuele Coccia, who doesn't need an introduction in an Italian setting, but let me do it for the international setting. Emanuele is a philosopher and professor at the École des Études des Sciences Sociales in Paris. And his work has focused a lot on expanding the grounds of philosophy so that it would be cast from a non-anthropocentric perspective. And his book, The Life of Plants, has been a classic in shaking those grounds, as well as his work on the Transitory Museum and his most recent book, The Philosophy of the House. There's a significant overlap between his work and what this Biennale is about, and therefore I'm extremely grateful for Emanuele to join us on Zoom after the discussion is over. The interviewees include Bruno Latour, a philosopher, anthropologist who used to be professor at the Sciences Po in Paris, and whose work has really transformed our thinking about society and agency, particularly his actor network theories, and with works like We Have Never Been Modern, Reassembling the Social, and more recently, Inquiry into Modes of Existence. Bruno is, in this particular series, almost a bridge between the section before and this one. Then we have Susan Goldthor, who's a biologist, zoologist, mycologist, and the president of the Boston Mycological Club. work has focused on dog behavior, livestock feeds, fisheries, mushrooms, and has taken her everywhere from Anatolia all the way to Alaska. Olivia Judson, an evolutionary biologist and journalist, has written extensively in newspapers like New York Times and magazines like The Economist and National Geographer. And her work focuses a lot on the lives of animals. And among her writings is a famous book called Dr. Tatiana's Sex Advice to All Creatures, all creations, which includes a lot of sex advice to animals. Vincent Desprez, a Belgian philosopher who has really helped shape single-handedly almost an area called animal studies within the larger field of ecology. And one of her main books is How to Live with Animals, Être Bête, that has also become a classic in this domain. And finally, we have the artist Violaine Lochu, who's a sound performing artist. Again, here, the work really, as you will see at the very end, it defies categorization between sounds of animals, primitive poetry, sound poetry, and experimental music. And her work has been shown, performed in many settings around the world. And we're lucky to have them all, and we're lucky to have Emanuele. So let the film begin, and after that, I'll come back on stage to have a discussion with Emanuele and open it to the public for questions. See you later.
So if a question is, will we be able to live together? It's another version of a question. We need to answer first another one, which is what is the we consider. If the we is humans among themselves, it's a very traditional question of political philosophy. And the answer is how to keep order, so to speak, in society, or justice. But we don't consider a vast extension of a we who are participants in the question of living together. Now, if we hear living together in ecological terms, and if we consider only humans, the question is, can humans live together? The answer is no, of course, because humans isolated from other living forms disappear as quickly as possible. We need bacteria, we need trees, clouds, waters. So there's nothing like a human-centered question of living together. Now, so far, the track record of this question, can we live together and will we be able to live together, is not very good, because modernization has been made almost entirely around the question of social order. And the scream, which can be a summary of the 20th century, is get lost, all of the others. I mean, just we don't need to consider you. So the answer is no, we don't want to live with you. You being, for instance, bacteria, we use antibiotics to destroy you. We don't want to live with you, tigers and elephants and etc. We don't want to live with you, forest, etc. So I guess that there is behind this question, if it's raised by architects, a sort of feeling of culpability, let's say, for not having raised this question earlier, so to speak, and where the question of living together is more important than building things. So this is probably the reason why they have introduced this question for the Biennale, because Le Corbusier will not have this question of living together. He would have asked, where do we build and how many other entities can we expulse or exclude, so to speak. So it is a well-meaning question, which entirely depends on the span of entities which have to be taken into account. Because if we say it's just human, it's just cities, it's just industry, we have one set of answers. If we say no, it's also all of the conditions that allow those cities and people to behave and be sustained, it's a different one. So I will turn around the question and add another one before, which in my view is more interesting, which is how many entities do we take into account first? So political task is double. First, settle the question of how many do we take into account, and then only the question of can we live together can be actually sort of articulated. Then if we ask the first question, there are two questions inside this first question. The one is how many entities coming around have to be heard? It can be poor people, or it can be foreign land, or it can be bacteria or animals and trees and poisons and so on. So there's a question of the hearing mechanism by which you let new entities enter into the question of the we. And then, still in the first question, how many are we? There is another task, which is to inquire on the bona fide right, so to speak, of those entities to be taken into the we. Because we cannot take, no community, no architect, no polity can take into account everything. But we need to have a system by which, when there are new entities coming in and knocking at the door and say we want to be part of a we, they need to be sort of inquired about and sort of articulated and entered. And this is the task of scientists, citizens, and politicians, and so on, to let them have a say, so to speak. Because in my view, scientists are the ones who are doing this job of hearing about new entities and making them enter properly the collective who is asking this question of can we live together. Once this task is settled, the task of listening to new voices and inquiring about their state, so to speak, their standing. It can be a river, or it can be clouds, it can be climate, it can be anything. Then the question of can we live together can be raised. And this question itself has two tasks, so to speak. One of them is, okay, you want to live with me, you want to live with me, this we don't want to live with you, this we want to live with. Task of hierarchy. That is giving orders of importance to all those entities we have accepted in the first task, okay? And that's a very difficult and tricky question, which is, do you prefer to have plastic bags and polluted seas, or do you want to have clean seas, but then you don't want that? All of these orders is what is in question in every decision, technical decision, and architects, of course, are very aware of that. But that's a really different task from the two others I described before. And then, once we have a hierarchy, we have to have a decision. Yes, we want to live with votes and not with votes. And here, it's a clearly legal and political decision which has to be made, which is to say, okay, now that we have accepted these entities into the common life, so to speak, this is decided. We now have said that we don't want plastic bags, for example, to take this example. It's a bit silly, but it's a nice example. Or we want to have buildings which have to be completely composed of local resources or something like that. And then it's the institution part. It's a decision. So asking in general the question, can we live together without making these differences between those four different tasks is a bit empty, because it feels good to say, yes, we will live together, but it's completely mistaken, because first, there are lots of things. I mean, I had bed bugs for 1 week. I had bed bugs in my house in Paris, and I can tell you I don't want to live with this. and I was ready to do absolutely everything to get rid of them. So living together is an empty term coming from the harmonious idea of nature that the deep ecologists have imagined. It's a good question if you say, okay, there are 4 different tasks, 2 big questions, how many are we and can we live together? But the first task itself is made of 2 tasks, listening to the new entities and inquiring about them. And the second task is to make a hierarchy, that's the hardest one actually. And the 4th one is to say, okay, now we have decided, we keep going. Of course, there is a little trick here, is that once you have decided to live with those entities against those entities, you are probably mistaken. And hell is paved with good intention. So you need a way to revise these political procedures. Because as soon as you have decided that it's very good, for example, to green cities, this is a very interesting question of architecture, then you have people who say it's completely ridiculous to make trees in cities. What you need is to white cities. And it's much more efficient in terms of energy, albedo, and so on. So immediately you have a dispute once you have instituted a form of life. So you need a revision of a system by which those 4 different tasks has to be combined.
I think that we cannot imagine anymore to live without thinking about living with animals. Virus, for example, is a very good example of what happens to us. And we discovered last year with the first quarantine that birds were living with us and we didn't even imagine that they were there. But a lot of people heard them singing and it was really joyful, the first quarantine. No, the second quarantine, they pretty more muted by all the noise we have around. So if I think about how will we live with all these animals, and I want us to think about that, I think that the first thing that we should, and that this pandemic has taught us, is that we will live in thinking very seriously about distances. Which means that if this virus could make so much fun among us, is probably because, and mostly because, we don't know anything about distances anymore. Which means that we're not sure about the pangolin hypothesis, but we're not sure about the bat hypothesis, about the bats. But we have to think that if the bats could contaminate humans, it's because they met each other where they shouldn't have met. Because bats do not wish to live with humans. They live in cavern and in the country. Which means that if bats came into contact with humans, we have multiple hypotheses about that. It's first because their own territory were completely stolen from them, and that they probably did not have habitat anymore, which means that they are obliged, they ought to live with us. And some of the people who thought about that also made the hypothesis that if the bats came so much around the humans and so close to the humans being, it might be because of the waves, of the 5G waves that completely disturb them, and finally they don't find the wood, they don't find the ways anymore, they don't know where they are anymore, and so they are coming too close from human people. And I think that is the signals that something is going really wrong in that world, that we have to live with other beings, but we consider, and I think that's not all humans, but some of us, and unfortunately the most powerful among us, are really thinking like if we were home everywhere, which means that having the feeling of being home everywhere means that your territory is completely overlapping other territories, and that animals do not have any places to live. And most of animals today are not only going to be extinct because of hunting, because of starving, because of a lot of things, but also because they do not have any spaces anymore to live.
The existence of plants on Earth modified radically the Earth because of the photosynthesis, or because of the fact that they are, in a way, first of all, responsible for the presence of the oxygen on the atmosphere, but also because of the fact, and above all, because of the fact that they are the only living beings, or of these sites, in a way, that are able to catch the sun energy, the solar energy, and to in a way to put it within matter, so, and to make it available for other living beings. Which means there is a very, very beautiful, in a way, fact, the fact that actually all our life is depending on the sun energy or the sunlight. So every time that everybody is eating, every animal is eating, actually we are searching, or we are looking for this light, and what we call food, or what we call nutrition, is this actually this kind of very secret trade of sunlight, which is going from body to another body, to a species, from another species, and from a kingdom to a kingdom. So the life on Earth is, in a way, the life of the sunlight, which animates the mineral body of Gaia, so in a way. But besides of that, actually, so the plants are, in a way, capturing and catching this light, and they redesign totally the planet, which means that, so Gaia, or the Earth, is actually a garden, but a garden where the plants are not just the content or the species to be seen, but the gardeners themselves. So and we could speak about that also for every living being. So every living being is a gardener, so a landscape architect, and every piece of the Earth is not the natural ecosystem, is actually a garden or a landscape produced by a lot of gardeners, a lot of living species. Or we could say even, perhaps we could go even further and say that actually we should, starting, for instance, to consider living species or ecosystems as sort of biennial, so multi-specific biennial, in the sense that, let's take, for instance, let's start from, because it could be too abstract, let's start from a very stupid example. So you are just strolling around on the country, so, and you're seeing a lot of flowers. So those flowers are pollinized normally by bees or by insects. And what is interesting is the fact that, so from this point of view, flowers are structures which allow plants to put their own genetical and biological destiny in the hands of other species, in the hands of individuals who are belonging to other kingdoms. So in a way, that means, for instance, that flowers put actually insects in the same position of what we call geneticians or breeders. And that means, for instance, that in nature there is always genetical modification, artificial genetical modification from a species to a species. So every living species is also the agriculture of other species, or every living species is, in a way, has relationship of husbandry toward other species. So agricultural husbandry are not just human business, But what is interesting in the example of bees and flowers is the fact that this genetical activity of modifying the biological destiny of other species is not based on rational calculus, because a bee is actually visiting a flower or another flower, so it's deciding who is mating with whom, just on the base of sugar, so just on the base of taste, actually. So, but that means that we, if it's true, and it's true, that we have to consider the evolution as a sort of artistic curatorial activities, because the evolution of the plants is based on choices based on taste, which is art, which is fashion. So in a way we have to consider, or that means that the space on the natural spaces are actually on much, in a way, on a longer time, as the same structure as a museum. And we have to consider ecosystems as this kind of contemporary natural expositions, or contemporary nature biennial, where every species is curated by other species, and every species is also a work of art, curated by other species. So, and from this point of view, what I'm stressing is the fact that we really have, first of all, to consider that everything in nature is artificial, because nature is just a huge amount of techniques shared by a lot of agents. And secondly, that in a way, this artificiality is every time exactly the same contingent and aesthetical or religious reasons that it has in our lives. So in a way we have really to accept what Darwin showed. So in a way, Darwin showed that we are animals. That means that our mind is a question of atoms, molecules, biological structures, and so on. But that means that mind is everywhere, because if mind is a question of atoms, then mind is really everywhere, not just in humans. And also because nowadays that once that we acknowledge that even plants are thinking, that is, that living beings do not need a brain or nervous system in order to think, then really what we call in French esprit, or Geist in German, mind or consciousness, you can call it as you want, but that is everywhere we live, and on each scale of matter, so from the atom to the sun. So, and once that you acknowledge that, then you are obliged to consider that everything is at the same time artistic, artificial, political, religious, and so on. The question is that it is difficult normally to understand the religion of other species, or the art of other species. It's difficult to understand the religion or the culture or the language of other, in a way, of other human beings. Then it's much more difficult to understand the language of, of bees or of. But we know that they have a language, so it's the question is just it's difficult to understand them, and in a way to develop, to negotiate with them. So.
Starting about 370 million years ago, there was an era called the Carboniferous. And during this era, plants learnt how to form trees. Now, before this, they made cellulose, which is a simple compound, and they were making small plants, maybe, like this, mosses, whatever. And at some point, they learned how to make lignin. Lignin is a really complicated chemical, and it is really tough. People have compared it to Bakelite, the plastic that early telephones were made out of. It's essentially indestructible. And lignin is what gives plants the structural strength that allows them to grow upward and form trees. So they started to produce trees. And at that point, the US and England were pretty much joined at the hip. And they were, well, both North America and Europe were hanging out around the equator. So it was warm. And there was also more land because the oceans were lower. So it was a great place to have tremendous plant growth. And when plants started to make trees, they really went overboard. They overdid it. They were forming lignin to the extent that they were using many, many times the amount of lignin in their bark, for example, that a modern tree would have. So all of a sudden, you have this huge growth of plants. And in fact, it was so enormous that so much carbon dioxide was sequestered that the oxygen levels in the atmosphere dropped so far that there would be spontaneous fires. This is why you see, dragonflies with these tremendous wing spreads, because the partial pressure of oxygen was high enough to drive oxygen into their spiracles to a body size that's bigger than any insect today. It was a very weird period, the Carboniferous. And the reason that this just went on and on and on, with more and more trees growing and more stuff piling up in marshes and bogs and everywhere, and it just kept piling and piling and piling, is that no creatures on Earth had learned how to digest lignin. The lignin is almost impossible to digest. There's no enzyme that we can call a lignase. And the only creatures really which digest lignin today are the fungi. When we see rot fungi in wood, they are sort of digesting it. But in fact, the way they are digesting it is that they are generating hydrogen peroxide. In other words, they haven't been able to really digest it, but they've learned how to kind of explode it, how to blow it apart. But it took a long time for them to learn this trick. And until they learned it, nothing got digested. So by the time that the fungi had started to break down lignin, the trees had also, the plants had started to calm down in their production of lignin. So it was like our modern trees. So by the time that it got into sync, it was 60 to 70 million years later. And in all that time, this wood has been building up, which turned to peat, which turned to lignite, which turned to coal. And so you have coal beds in this sites of the Carboniferous that are 40 feet deep or more. This is the coal that we have, that England has It's not an accident that the Industrial Revolution started in these places. And what happened was that we started burning all that coal. We reversed the Carboniferous. And that is why we have climate change.
The relationship with other species starts not at the moment when we are meeting other individuals coming from other species. So the multi-specific encounters takes place already in our body or in our lives, because each species is, in a way, in nature, a form of interspecific mixture or dialogue or encounters. In a way, that's the first consequence of the discovery of Darwin's discovery of the evolution of species. What does it mean that every species comes from a previous species? It means that every species, in a way, carries in itself rest or parts of other species from an anatomical point of view, from an ecological point of view, from an ecological point of view. So even if we take the human body and the human species, it's a sort of patchwork of different forms of life which are unified in a contingent, ephemeral form that, which we call human, but it's not a substance, it's just an enormous bricolage of other species. I mean, if you are taking our DNA, it's a patchwork of different forms of life. If we are taking our body, it's a patchwork of, or in a way, if we are taking each part of our body, we share each part of our body with a lot of species. We share the fact that having eyes with 1 million of other species, having a nose with 1 million of other species. That means that being human means already to have the experience of being other species. Being, not just encounter. We are already sort of riding zoos, actually. Each of us is a zoo. Each living being is a sort of multi-specific spectrum. So that's the first point, and it's important to stress it because, I mean, the question of living together with other species starts in a way or coincides with how can I live good with myself, and it's not that we have first of all to solve the question how can we live as human being, and then only afterwards we have to solve the question of living with other species. So the question of the a good multi-specific way of life coincides with the good monospecific way of life. So so the first consequence of this idea is that the way we used to build cities is an absurdo. It's in a way the wrongest way of conceiving cities, because we used to conceive cities as in a way as a very paradoxical monocultural spaces. I mean, we used to think we used to think that states or cities are Leviathan, in the words of Hobbes, so the collection of all bodies of women and men resting on a mineral space, or a space of stones. And we are actually used to reject all other species outside the city. So that is in a way the idea from where comes the word forest, which means actually which comes from the Latin foris, which means outside of the city. So we used to consider cities, states, politics as the collection of human bodies, monocultural collection of human bodies that rejects outside itself everything which does not belong to humanity. So there is little exceptions. So a couple of trees, dogs, in the past also horses, cats, in an illegal way also rats, or a couple of insects. But in a way, cities are the first example monoculture. And from this point of view, it's totally stupid to accuse agriculture to be the one who invented monoculture. The real monocultural culture is the city. So we have, first of all, to change or to overcome this division. And we have to change it because of very, very material reasons. Because to think of life as the simple association of human and stones, in a way, means to think of deserts. So, in a way, cities are the first cause of desertification in the world, because when you are putting together only human beings and stones, you are producing literally deserts in a way. So, and in order to overcome that, in order to overcome this opposition between cities and forests, we have to, at the same time, reintroduce other non-human species within cities. But we have also, and that's perhaps the most important and the most difficult way, we have also to start considering forests as non-human cities. Because, of course, now architects and urbanists are producing a lot of examples of reforestation of cities. I think of Stefano Boeri's vertical forest, but there is a huge amount of attempts also of putting again agricultural space within cities and so on. But we also have to, in a way, try to change the way we consider non-urban spaces or non-human spaces, that it's the ancient forest, in the sense that we really have to consider that, or we really have to start thinking that cities are not purely human structures, and that every non-human being is producing cities or is designing spaces and so on. And that's perhaps, in order to do that, we have to reconsider two elements of the way we consider animals, plants, or bacteria and so on. First of all, we have to stop considering that human beings are the only one to have an agency. So agency is the most common thing existing in the universe. So every living being is able of taking a decision about his or her own life. So plants are thinking, bacteria are thinking, viruses are thinking. But that also means, if we are really rigorous in this, in the fact of acknowledging that other living beings are also self-conscious and able of agency, we also have to acknowledge that they are also able to make bad decisions, that in a way every other living being is able to make bad choices. And that point is perhaps the most difficult point for contemporary ecology, because actually the contemporary debate about ecological stuff or ecological problems nowadays starts from the positions that actually, except for human beings, every other living being is able to produce a paradise on Earth. So if human beings stop being human beings and stop producing Anthropocene or catastrophes and so on, the Earth would be a paradise on Earth. The Earth would be a sort of paradise where everybody is living together in a very positive way, which is totally stupid.
When I think about fungi in the future, it's very hard to differentiate them from plants, from the role of plants in the future, and really from soil. And people have pointed out that at this point, at different times, we've had different big unknowns, like space was a big unknown, underwater, undersea was a big unknown. But at this point in time, the biggest unknown is probably the soil that is underfoot and that we treat as if it is dirt. And it turns out that everything is dependent on soil, and soil is being attacked by a number of sort of unexpected threats. I was just reading about a really unexpected threat, which is earthworms. Here in North America, we have no native earthworms at all. And the reason is the glacier. The glacier pretty much wiped out whatever earthworms we might have had. So every earthworm that we have, and we have quite a few now, is basically, it's an invasive alien. And some are more invasive than others. And we always think of earthworms as, we think of them as the gardener's friend. They're these wonderful creatures who mix up the soil. But people who are doing research now on northern forests, especially, for example, Minnesota has done a lot of work on this. They are seeing earthworms that are eating the top layer of the forest. The top layer of a northern forest is sort of humus, or sometimes called duff. It's an easy to digest, soft layer that is really important for our ecosystems. So there's a fungal mat in there. It is the place where seedlings grow. It holds moisture for not only for native plants, but also for things like salamanders and little frogs, a variety of animals and plants. And the earthworms are eating up this layer. One set of researchers put it that they are eating the soil from the roots of seedling trees. And the trees are dying. So there is the possibility that we will lose our native plantings, many of our native trees. There's always something tough that's left, but it's not a whole ecosystem, and it's not necessarily what we would want. And it's going to be because we're seeing more and more species of earthworms that are they are moving very, very fast. So at this point, there are places in Alaska where the biomass of earthworms is greater than the biomass of moose. They are eating the part of the soil that much of our native forest and understory plants depend on. And then, of course, there's the part underneath that, which is full of it's a whole microbiome of everything you can imagine, bacteria, tiny insects, fungi. One thing I realized at one point is that every every scientist who's studied the soil sees it in terms of their specialty. So I see it in terms of an incredible fungal mat. Because when you see, for example, a mushroom, I mean, the mushroom is just a transient attempt for the underground fungus to have sex. And very, very, very few fungi do this. If there are maybe 5 million species of fungi in the world, maybe 10,000 of them can create a mushroom. But underground is what we call the mycelium. It's this net of fungal threads. And that is the real fungus. And the mycelium can live forever. And it can travel incredible distances, and it can, what it does, because fungi, in terms of evolution and in terms of physiology, fungi are actually closer to animals than they are to plants. They're like us. They breathe oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. And like us, they can't photosynthesize. They are dependent upon plants. We're all dependent upon plants for sugar, basically. So these underground fungi are forming partnerships with the roots of trees. And this is an amazing story that people are just starting to learn about. Until we could analyze DNA, we didn't know what was there. We really didn't know what was happening. But the linkage between fungi and plants is specific. Not every fungus, we call these mycorrhizal fungi because they form a tiny organ with the root of a plant that they actually enter into that's called a mycorrhiza. And the importance of this can be judged by something that was said a while ago by a biological conference meeting on this topic. And they said, basically, functionally speaking, plants don't have roots. They have mycorrhiza. And we think that when multicellular plants first came onto dry land, they came with mycorrhizal fungi. So this is one thing that's underground. And when you ask an entomologist what's underground, they'll tell you about all of the insects that are living there. And when you ask, another kind of zoologist, they'll talk about nematodes and other tiny creatures. And of course, a bacteriologist will talk about the bacteria, so that it's almost as if the soil is this living substance composed of the bodies of all of these creatures. And we're not being kind to them, and we are really, really dependent upon them. We talk about dirt. Dirt is abused soil that is dead. But if we don't have soil with this rich mix of tiny organisms, how will we live?
Every living species is has actually a political relationship to the space it occupies. What does it mean? It means that we have to stop considering that there is something like native species. That's sorry for the word, but it's totally bullshit from a scientific point of view. Actually, the idea that there would be something like native species is a discourse which started in the 19th century. It started first of all from the botany, and then it has also been translated for zoological species. And the first one who tried to consider that there is a sort of totally natural relationship between a plant and the space was a British botanist. It's important to stress that he was British because he could, in a way, think about this sort of static relationship between a species and the land, because of the fact that he was living on an island, actually. And it has been proved that the model of the island has had a terrible influence on the ecological thinking. So in 19th century, actually, Watson was writing a book about British flora. So the book was called The British S.E.L, and he started saying that in order to consider a plant to be authentically British, he had to distinguish plants that used to live in Britain for a lot of centuries from the plants that came to Britain or to England just for ornamental reasons or just for a couple of years. In the same way, he adds, you cannot consider British, German or French people who are coming just for touristic reasons. So, and starting from this point of view, from this point, we consider that there are some plants which are native or indigenous, autochthonous, and plants which are not autochthonous. And what he did was actually to apply categories from the common law. So he literally took the categories of citizenship that the common law in the 19th century used to use in order to classify populations, so citizen, denizen, alien, and so on. And he applied this kind of categories to plants. So it was a sort of counter-totemist or anti-totemist operations, which is totally ridiculous, because in a way he was asking plants to behave like good British citizens, which is totally, and each time that we are trying, or each time that we are speaking about a plant or an animal has autochthonous or has indigenous, we are asking again plants or animals to behave like good human beings of the 19th century, because the paradox is that in that time to travel was much more difficult than nowadays. So that's the first point. So the first point is to realize that the idea of an indigenous species is a projection of human categories on non-human living beings. The second point is that from a biological point of view, the relationship of a plant or of an animal or of a living being to the land, to the piece of soil it occupies, it is never natural and is never eternal. First of all, for instance, each tree, which is in a way the paradigmatic idea of, or the Platonic idea of sort of static living being, is obliged normally to throw away its children from itself in order to avoid, in a way, competition. So each tree, so the most static and the most non-dynamic living being on Earth actually is a migrant starting from the beginning. So, and other living beings are also, in a way, if trees are migrants, what should we think about lions or bacteria or viruses which normally travel for thousands of kilometers through winds or through other animals and so on. So in a way, life is always a migrant force. Also because, and we never consider that from a geological point of view, in a way, land is also a migrant stuff. So in a way, because of the tectonic of plates, so every continent is a sort of boat which is traveling around on the sphere, which is the Earth. So there is, in a way, only migrants, and there is only, in a way, a negotiation about on which boat should we live.
You know, what Suzanne Simard discovered was that it's not just that the fungi are making mycorrhizal connections with the roots of trees, it's that they are joining trees together. And they are joining trees together in ways that can encompass an entire forest. And there's a lot of communication going on within this web, which is called, it's called the Wood Wide Web, and that name was given to it by some unsung editor of Nature, the journal, when Suzanne Simard's article first appeared in it, and that name has stuck. Other people have tried to call it the Internet of the Forest, but Wood Wide Web is a great name. And when she first came out with this finding, people really didn't want to believe it. And the part of it that they really didn't want to believe was that it was a socialist system, that the trees that had gotten access to capital, and for a green plant, we'll say that one form of capital is sunlight. So there are trees up at the canopy, and they have access to capital, and they are making sugar, and they're sending a tremendous percent of the sugar down to their roots. I mean, close to half in many cases. And they are sharing it with the fungi. But the fungi are then sharing it with other trees, and they're sharing it with trees that are not able to get up to the canopy and access as much sunlight. So there was a lot of resistance to the idea of this socialism in the forest. And then people decided, well, if they're sharing it with their own seedlings, it's okay. But then more research showed that they're actually sharing it with not just their own seedlings, but different species of trees in the forest. And the other thing is that they're sharing it with some plants that are basically parasitic. They're plants that don't photosynthesize. An example in our local forests here in the Northeast is something called Indian pipe. These plants are called monotropes, and they are being fed by the fungal web, which is sneaking them some sugar from the trees. And of course, the fungi are also taking the sugars. And they, in turn, are feeding the plants. They're giving them phosphorus, they're giving them nitrogen, they're giving them water, because the fungal net, this very tiny, thin filaments that fungi send out can travel much further and get into places that plant roots can't. And the other thing is that plants can't do, I mean, they can make sugar, but they cannot do all the things that the fungi can do. For example, the fungi can free up phosphorus from the minerals that it's bound to. They can do this by extruding acids. And they can also, they can rot the duff of the forest floors. But the other thing that we're learning about fungi is how many of them are carnivorous. And that's really interesting that, for example, there's a little fungus that affiliates especially with pine trees in the forests that I know. And it was the very first fungus to have its DNA completely sequenced. And through a series of experiments, a scientist in British Columbia named John Cloronimus noticed that the hyphae, the threads of this particular fungus were not being eaten by little tiny insects called springtails that eat the hyphae of other fungi. And when he looked at the analysis of the DNA, he noticed that a section of it was very similar to snake venom. And it turned out that this particular little fungus is killing these tiny insects called springtails, which exist by the billions, and feeding some of that nitrogen to its trees. So, I mean, the trees basically are getting the NPK that gardeners feed plants in the garden from their fungal partners. And this partnership is very flexible and very labile. So as long as the tree needs nitrogen and phosphorus, it will keep the fungal partners that can do this for them. And a tree may have 100 different fungal partners or more. And each of those may be doing something different for the tree. But if, for example, the tree starts to get nitrogen or phosphorus from, say, acid rain or runoff, or because somebody has thought that fertilizer was a good idea for the forest, the tree will just get rid of those fungal partners. The tree knows what it's getting from all of its potentially thousands of fungal partners. And if it stops getting what it needs, it will simply stop giving that partner sugar. And it's amazing we're learning how intelligent plants are. So there was a book recently that was called, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? Of course we're not. And there should be another book, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Plants Are? And a lot of botanists are starting to work on this and to understand that plants are so responsive, and they don't have a nervous system or a brain that we know of, but when we look at them, it's as if they do.
Realizing that every living species is coming from elsewhere should help us also to stop quarreling about very stupid stuff, like also in gastronomic debates about food which is coming from the real authentic land and so on. I mean, I'm coming from Italy, and if you are looking at the typical Italian plate, which is pasta al ragù, there is nothing typically Italian, because pasta is made out of wheat, which is coming from Middle Orient, and tomatoes are American, are not Italian at all. So it's sort of every food is in a way multicultural and in a way globalized. There is no such a thing like typical. Of course, then we have to in a way to avoid homogenization, but there is nothing like a typical food or a typical identity. There is no identity. It's impossible to produce a static identity in relationship to a space, because of the fact that every relationship to a space is political. So every relationship to the space is produced by a negotiation by different species. And from this point of view, we have to start to realize that, for instance, what we call biome, or what we normally consider as a natural association of some species on a specific piece of land or territory, is not natural at all. It's also, as France, as Germany, the result of previous negotiation by different species who started living in a space and who also modified the space in order to make their own life possible. Because the other point that we have, or the other consequence of the fact that we have to consider that every natural space is a political space, so every forest is a city, is that we have to realize that every species is modifying in a very strong way the space it occupies. So, for instance, we now know, for instance, that the Amazonian forest is producing by itself the rains that it needs. So it's not that the trees on the Amazonian forest are there because of the fact that from a climatic point of view, there is a lot of water and there is a lot of rains. No, it's exactly the opposite. Because of the existence of those trees on this area, there is a lot of rain. So that is just one of the billion examples of the fact that every living being is not just adapting itself to its environment. It's actually normally the opposite. Every living being is actually modifying the environment in order to make its own life possible. So exactly like us. So we are in a space like also this house, and we have to arrange the space in order to make our life possible. And we are particularly, in a way, skilled in order to modify the space in order to live. But every living species is actually modifying the space which is surrounding it in order to live better. So every living species is a sort of designer of the world, or architects of the world. And so from this point of view, architecture is not just a human business. It's the business of every living being, starting from the bacteria, actually, starting from the viruses, which are actually the life of a virus is actually the design of different living beings. So the active redesign of different living beings in order to make its own life possible. So design and architecture are everywhere.
There's one thing I wanted to say, which is that one prominent biologist once said that he would be willing to eat the last panda on Earth if it would save the microbial community, if it would draw people's attention to the microbes. Because when organizations try to save an ecosystem, they go for an iconic, what we call the iconic megafauna, because you can't tell people to save bacteria. You can't tell them to save fungi or tiny microscopic worms. But we all hope that maybe if people save the elephants, if they save the panda, if they save the grizzly bear, the wolf, that maybe the microbial communities will also be saved.
So I want to bring a planetary perspective to this question of living together. And by planetary, I don't mean global. I mean Earth as opposed to Mars or some other world. And I don't just mean humans. I mean all life forms here today. The essential thing to realize is that over the course of its long history, Earth has been transformed almost beyond imagining, and much of that transformation is due to the activities of organisms that lived and died ages ago. And just to give an example, for the first half of Earth history, the air had no oxygen to speak of. All of the oxygen atoms were tied up in the water and the rocks. And it was not until the evolution of a group of life forms called the cyanobacteria that began to change. All of the oxygen that you inhale with every breath, that keeps you going, that allows you to think and live, all of that has been put here by the activities of living organisms. Or to give another example, think about mountain ranges. This seems something very far removed from life, but nevertheless, mountain ranges here are influenced by the activities of life. So animals like corals, they build enormous limestone structures. You could think of the Great Barrier Reef, which today runs 2,300 kilometers along the coast of Australia. So it's vast. And although animals, and particularly corals, have not been around for all that long meaning not more than a few 100 million years, life forms of some sort have been building limestone structures for many billions of years. And the thing about limestone is that it's a very malleable rock, as rocks go. And so the presence of large amounts of limestone in areas where the earth begins to upheave mountains will change the way that those mountains fold. And so even organisms, something that seems so far removed from life is nevertheless influenced by it. And thinking about life on Earth this way has changed the way that I see the world. It's changed what I think it means to be alive. It gives me a sense of connection with the water, the rocks, the air, as well as with all other living beings. And I find it very moving to think that the planet that we experience today is to a very large extent the product of the activities of other life forms. I find it beautiful. It's also changed the way that I think about Mars. As you probably know, Mars today is the focus of escape fantasies of a group of people who don't want to live together. It's the idea that a small band of chosen people will take a long journey. They will leave this tainted world and they will take a long journey in a kind of purgatory, and they will arrive at a new Eden. But have you ever really looked at Mars? Have you lined up Mars and the Earth next to each other and really looked at them? Mars is unbelievably inhospitable. For a human to survive there, even for a moment or two, you have to be within a small shell of the Earth. You have to wear a spacesuit that allows you to have some kind of earthly environment with you. The Martian temperatures are freezing cold. Radiation pours off the sun. It's not blocked out from the Martian atmosphere by ozone the way that it is here, because ozone is itself a product of the activities of life. And besides, it's just a vista of bare rock. Now, it hasn't always been as inhospitable as it is today. It seems that 3.5 billion years ago or so, Mars had water. It might even have had oceans, and it's possible that life of some kind emerged there. It's even possible that life of some kind lives there still, somewhere deep beneath that rusty, dusty, lethal surface. After all, there are some organisms that live very deep within the Earth. Perhaps there are organisms that live very deep within Mars. And don't get me wrong, it would be incredibly exciting to find life forms of Mars. It would allow us to answer some of the greatest scientific questions of all time. It would have metaphysical implications for how we understand ourselves. But we don't need to go to Mars to know that whatever has happened there is fundamentally different from what has happened here. If there is anything living within Mars, it is limited and sparse. Earth, in contrast, screams, alive! Now, this has some bearing on the whole question of what an Earth-like planet is. People like to talk about the search for Earth-like planets, Earth 2.0. And if all you mean by that is a wet, rocky planet not very far from a star, there are probably countless billions. But if you mean a planet that is comfortable for humans, there may only be one. This one. After all, Earth itself has not been comfortable for humans for most of its history. If you had a time machine and were to travel back into the past, you would very quickly arrive at a point where you too needed a spacesuit just as surely as if you were going to Mars or the moon. Earth feels perfect for us because we have evolved with it. But all of the indications are that human activities are changing the planet in such a way that it may not remain perfect for us for all that much longer. The study of life and Earth has convinced me that the Anthropocene is real. Humans are exerting fundamental changes on the life-Earth system. We are not the first life forms to have effected large changes, but humans are effecting these changes faster and far more of them all at once. The changes that humans are causing are unprecedented in their scope and unprecedented in their speed. This is terrifying, but it is also an opportunity, because as far as we know, humans are the only life form that has ever been able to reflect on the impacts that we are having. And that means we have a choice. We can choose to continue as we are, which will be disruptive not only for ourselves, but for every other life form here. And as far as we know, this is the only planet in the whole cosmos that has such diversity and richness of forms. Or we can change.
Good afternoon again. Thank you for participating in the first part of the meeting today, which is the third part of the film, How Will We Live Together, produced by Sensory Ethnography Lab. The second part consists of a conversation with Emanuele Coccia, whom you saw on the screen earlier, presenting his point of view about how will we live together, particularly focusing on the life of plants. What I would like to do, if possible, I can see Emanuele now. Hi, Emanuele.
Hi.
Good to see you live.
Thank you for having me.
Emanuele, where in the world are you, by the way?
Today I'm in Paris now.
Oh, okay.
I was in the south of France yesterday, but now I'm in Paris.
It's la rentrée. Emanuele, I would like to ask you two questions, but before I do, since you are here and you just saw the film, and the film is set up to be a dialogue of sorts between you and the other thinkers about this question, whether you had some response, having heard them dialogue with you kind of virtually, to what they were saying.
Now, first of all, I mean, aside from the discuss not having to listen to me so much, it was interesting to, in a way, to me, what I was thinking now looking at the film is the fact that it is a sort of invitation, first of all, of adopt a wider and more heterogeneous concept of space, because I mean, we are in the context of the architecture biennial, and we are speaking about architectural issues. But what is interesting is what all those people, and even people who spoke in the first two parts of the film, are claiming is that the space we used to consider as the peculiar space in a way adopted or used or imagined or built by architects was a tiny part of the real inhabited space of the world. I mean, we have to, first of all, we have to change the very idea of soil, and that is what Susan at the beginning of the film was saying. So soil is not just this geometrical extension of just space. Soil is the sort of huge skyscraper where there are a lot of different inhabitants who are already there. So this is, of course, changing totally the representation of what architects are using, or what architects are representing, or what architects are changing, because we are even, each time that we are building houses or buildings, we are in a way not just putting there in not inhabited space. We have to consider that soil is already inhabited, so we have to invent forms of negotiation in order not to destroy everything. But also what was interesting is the fact that in a way there are other parts of the space that are to be added, in the sense that air is to be considered also as a already inhabited space, and then light, and then water, and so on. So this kind of film evoked me, or obliged me to consider that space is really wider than I thought, but it's also more and more different than I used to thought, and that we have perhaps to quit, to abandon this, in a way, the very central category for architecture in modernity, which is space in a geometrical Cartesian sense. Because there is no space in a way, because everything on Earth is full of living beings. And there is no space there is no objective space, because everything is full of subjects. So from this point of view, this film is an invitation to perhaps to invent a sort of animist architecture where there is no more space, no more objects, there are just subjects. And in a way, this is what also Bruno Latour said at the beginning, when he said, we have, before asking how do we live together, or how can we live together, we have to ask how many people are there, so how many living beings are already there. And this is perhaps and this becomes perhaps the most important and most urgent architectural questions. And then the second point I was thinking about looking at the film was that perhaps architecture should finally abandon also the idea of city. Perhaps city is how can I say, sort of a concept that we should stop using, because it makes no sense if space is soil, air, water, and so on, and if everywhere there are already living beings and there are already inhabitants, then the concept of city makes no more sense, because it's not. Also, because in a way, the problem of the concept of city, in my opinion, is that what I try to say is that city is this illusion that there is some space in the world which belongs to us as humanity, which also is false. So those are the 2 points that, in a way, I was thinking of looking at the film. But from this point of view, it's a very interesting manifest for a new kind of architecture, with new objects, with new ideas, with new questions, and so on.
Which leads me in a good way to the first question I wanted to ask you, because in a way your work, Emanuele, whether it is on plants or more recently on houses or on the museum, challenges some of the very established concepts about space and what it is, about the notion of the object and what it is, what its boundaries are, and about this very question of identity that you've been interrogating through botany as well. So even though you don't always speak about architecture directly and its agency, there are very important implications about architecture through your theories, which are going to force us one way or the other to rethink architecture's agency in society and the world. And I just wanted to share with you 3 examples that came out of your presentation today. The first is the idea of the forest versus the city. And here you've demonstrated in your work that architecture has always been connected to the idea of city. And it finds city to be its context and therefore the forest to be foreign to the city. It is what is outside, not just the city, but what is outside of architecture. And therefore, if we are to rethink of what kind of architecture will bring the forest back in, or what is the architecture that is going to help bridge between city and forest, what would it be? In the Biennale, there are, as you know, 5 scales, 5 sections. And in the section across borders, there are a few projects that straddle that line. And then in the section, even on the household, there are projects that begin to think of the other dimensions, the soil and the air, as being constitutive of the notion of the house. So we are beginning to explore that, but it does take suspending a lot of preconceptions about architecture to begin to open up that boundary between forest and city. That's one dimension. The other dimension is what you have emphasized here again in your presentation about the idea of mobility, that this notion that architecture or species are to be grounded, are indigenous, are native, is to be questioned deeply. Well, architecture has always been weighted by this responsibility, that architecture is about place, not just space. And therefore, it's not only to be grounded in its place, but it is to take that excessive dimension of having to express place, to make place even more authentic, more there. And once we begin to question that relationship, architecture is obviously freed of that burden, but then how does it begin to respond to space? And then the third and final concept that you bring up is the idea of objects or humans or entities being patchworks, that they are not self-contained gestalts, but they belong to different groups, different patches that somehow intersect into creating the object as we see it. And here again, architecture is obsessed with its own gestalt, or has been up till now. And therefore, if we are to free it of its gestalt, what would it look like? These are at least 3 important dimensions that come out of your reconceptions that are going to affect us. And you cannot just come up with these ideas and leave us alone. You have to help us. So please, help us a little.
No, thank you, but they are huge questions. I don't know if I can answer to them in 30 minutes. I would need perhaps 3 days or 3 months. But jokes apart, starting from the first point of the forest, of the relationship between forest and city, it's true that there was this kind of opposition between forest and city, but it's also true, I was thinking in the last months that in a way, if we are following this, in a way, this, the very, how can I say, the storytelling of anthropologists about how cities were born, we know that actually we started to build cities because of our agriculture or because of gardens. So the idea is that actually the first groups, human groups that came to the idea of building cities were groups that decided to abandon their form of life of hunters and gatherers, and they decided to, in a way, to build a link, a time link or a temporal link with a collection of plants, a collection of trees, which was supposed to give to them food, which is interesting from an architectural point of view because it shows that gardens are not a secondary, how can I say, creation or a secondary aspect of cities. Gardens at the beginning of cities. It's because of gardens that we had the need of building cities that is fixed houses or fixed collective houses. And that's interesting, first of all, because if we are considering this, we can perhaps find a new way of combining forests and cities. But it is also interesting because it gives us a new insight in the fact that cities were born, at least at the beginning, already as an interspecific association. So if you really take seriously the idea that cities were born for groups that decided to make agriculture, to link their lives to a collection of trees or vegetal beings, then it means that cities are at the beginning association of people coming from different kingdoms, and perhaps we have to return or to come back to this original idea of cities as an originally association of different species coming from different kingdoms. And from this point of view, of course, it is not enough anymore to exhumate again the 19th century idea of the garden cities, because it's not just that. It's also because, and that is perhaps the second way of answering to your first question. Also because what we call actually Anthropocene, it's a very interesting, how can I say, a very interesting process of Anthropocene is the fact that there is no more a single spot on the planet which doesn't witness the presence of human beings. That means that every spot of this planet has been included in our house, in our home. So Anthropocene means literally that our homes has become in a way wider, and so much wide that it coincides with the planet itself. And this is on the one hand, a tragic history, but on the other hand, it's also very interesting because it means that we are now within our houses a lot of other people who don't belong to our species. So in a way, within our house has been invaded by a lot of other species. So from this point of view, the question of the biennial, of the Venice Biennale of this year is not even in a way, how can I say, a political question, is a domestic question. Because of Anthropocene, inside our houses, there are no more just rats or insects. There are all other living beings, and we have to find an arrangement with them, which is interesting. So put in this way, it is, I think, a very interesting way of try to rethink architecture as this kind of animistic arrangement of cohabitation on a common spot. And is a question which is based much more on perhaps a set of rituals of how can we live together, how can we stay on the same space, and not on the question how can we build forms and so on. So that would be perhaps very shortly the couple of answers to the first question. I don't know if you want to react to them, and then, or if you want that I try to answer to the 3 points, and then we can.
In a way, Emanuele, you have already touched on the other 2 points, but if I can just press a little bit more on the notion of mobility, because that is actually very radical. One of the interviewees, Stephen Greenblatt, in his book Cultural Mobility, argues that the very concept of culture has 2 very problematic and tricky ideas built into it. The first is that culture is homogeneous, and that it is not contaminated by others. It has only an exterior and interior and nothing in between. And the other dimension is that it's not mobile, it doesn't change, it doesn't move. But you're bringing a very similar perspective, but from the life of plants, to let us begin to imagine that those very categories that we have applied on humans, we've transferred to plants. But if we look at plants, they actually do not behave like that. And architecture seems to be also grounded in those very same categories. So even when we talk about the house, there are the typologies of the house, and the typologies of the house are connected to forms of life which are grounded in geography, in place. These are the categories that we operate with in architecture. We are very comfortable with those. Nation states found themselves on images of an architecture that is authentic, in the same way that they are founded on landscapes that are authentic. So you're going to take that away from us. What are we going to do? And how do we continue?
It's a very tricky question in the sense that, in a way, this idea of identity, which is produced by the fact that you are rooted on a ground, in a way, if you're thinking about that, it's a form of astrology, or of inverted astrology. You know, there is this Babylonian astrology that says your identity is, in a way, linked to the position of the planets at the moment you were born. And this national astrology is the idea that your identity is defined by the position of your body, or by the relationship of your body with another celestial body, which is the Earth, because we forget that the Earth is a part of the sky, it's not something. So, but then we build this kind of astrology, and it's interesting that we are all the time trying to dismiss the Babylonian astrology by saying that it's a form of superstition, and we are not. We are taking seriously the other form of astrology, with this, which is the national one, but which has the same epistemological foundation. So it is also a superstition. The idea. I mean, in my case, for instance, I'm supposed to be Italian, even if I spend most of my life outside Italy. And it's the same idea that since I was born on June 6th, I'm supposed to be Gemini, even if, I had a lot of experiences that changed my life in a very deep way. So this is a first, a joke, in a way, trying to answer to your question, but trying to give to you a more serious answer. I would say that perhaps we should also trying to stop thinking that we are living on the ground, because there is now this also, even in the ecological thinking, there is kind of new attempt of fetishizing the earth, the ground, the Gaia, and we are literally, for instance, forgetting that we are not just inhabiting the ground, the earth, we are inhabiting the sky. So actually, of course, we put our foot on the ground, but the most important space we are occupying are the very close part of the sky that we call atmosphere, that we actually, which we confuse with the earth, but it doesn't belong to the earth. So all this space is already sky. And from this point of view, perhaps we should, because we developed a science about celestial or what happens in the sky, which is called meteorology, which is a very, very interesting science. Why? Because it's a very complex science, but it is also a science where we do not try really to master what happens. We just try to avoid too much danger, but we let, in a way, to what happens in the sky a part of mystery. In a way, meteorology is the science of this domesticated sky where everything can happen,
And we are not so shocked. So it can be sunny, it can be cloudy, but we are accustomed to the fact that everybody in this part of the world has the freedom of doing whatever it wants. So, and everybody in this part of the world, in this meteorological part of the world, it has the right of moving all the time. So we do not consider. And so perhaps one of the key, or one of the idea should be, in my opinion, to consider meteorology as the ground science of architecture. So, or to have a meteorological look also on Earth. So, because whenever we are looking to ground phenomena, we try to master them and to, in a way, we expect, for instance, from living beings that they shows us a balance. I mean, when we are speaking about ecosystems, we are just trying to, in a way, to arrange the how can I say, the cohabitation of different living beings which are belonging to different kingdoms in a model which is the model of balance. And we never ask the sky to produce balance. So perhaps we have to, in a way, apply the meteorological look to the Earth and to finally accept that we also are meteorological entities.
When he traveled in Latin America and elsewhere, Alexander von Humboldt carried with him a tool, which he called the Cyanoscope, which he used to measure the blue of the sky. It consisted of a wheel of 53 colors of blue, and wanted to identify not just the geology, the plants and animals of the place, but what exact color of blue was that place. And I've always thought that that was, at one level, very controlling, wanting even the sky to be part of the section of the ground, but also liberating in the sense that even if you're defining a place's identity, it's in a degree of blue. It's a kind of meteorological definition, as you're calling it, as a shade of a universal entity. And I always admired that and aspired for architecture to also measure itself as a degree of blue, rather than as a kind of grounded object.
Yeah, that's a very beautiful metaphor, to make architecture a science of degree of colors. That's very nice.
If I can ask you one last question, it's related not so much to what you talked about today, but to your new book, The Philosophy of the House. And in it, you expound on an emotive dimension of the house, which is that of love. The Biennale has a whole section dedicated to the house. And indeed, if you go from the scale of the body to the scale of the world in the Biennale, there are sort of emotive scales associated with each section. By that I mean, if you're talking about among diverse beings, you can feel strongly that there's an attempt at building empathy. If you go to the scale of the household, it is about familiality or love, as you call it. The scale of the community, it's about a source of care. Across borders, a curiosity and respect. And when we get to the scale of the planet, it is truly about searching for a universal commonality. So in every one of these scales, there is an emotive dimension. But in your book, you make a very strong distinction between the scale of the house and the scale of the city, arguing that philosophy has not so much cared about the house or about love, but cared about the city and politics and order and association. However, a city, as some historical ethnographers tell us, is when two houses share a wall, meaning when the love extends outside the household to another house. Why is it important for you to make that strong distinction between house and city? And another dimension of the question is, when two houses share a wall, that means they are probably sharing a little bit more. And as we look at the new demographics of the world today, we know that within the household itself, only 30% of houses are the nuclear family. So can there be other forms of love within the household and forms of love that extend outside the household?
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, just a very short premise about the fact that it is important to stress this kind of order of love even in the in the question of interspecific cohabitation, because I was always thinking what is interesting in the fact, once that you domesticated an animal, or once that you are living with a dog or with a cat, what is interesting is that this cohabitation, the fact that you share the same house with an individual belong to a different species produces a relationship where you do not know anymore that this dog belongs to another species. There is some life that arises that belongs to, in a way, no more species anymore, and you are just related to an individual, and you do not know anymore to what species it belongs. And this is very important to the question, I think, of the Biennale, in the sense that the question how can we live together is also the question. Perhaps we should, in a way, try to define an ecology where the question is no more the fact that we have to live in an interspecific world. The question would be, we have to live in a world where the specific identity, the identity of the species disappear. So we do not know anymore to what species we all belong. But concerning the question of houses and city, I made this opposition for historical reasons. First of all, because what we call modernity could be described as the process through which actually the city has built itself against the domestic spaces, taking into account the question of work, the question of producing wealth. So in a way, modernity starts when the question of work, so the production of wealth, was no more a domestic question, was no more taking place within the houses, within the oikos, but became a public problem, a political problem, and that's why modern cities arose, so in a way. And we are now witnessing to a sort of very important and revolutionary reversal of this process, where the work is coming again to the house, and where the houses is in a way striking back in very different senses. First of all, we just had the experience during the pandemic lockdown. So the pandemic lockdown was a very interesting experience, first of all, because it was the first time in history, in human history, that practically the entire humanity passed through the same moral experience, which is amazing. We all had a very similar experience, and this experience is the fact that we could not use cities anymore. So we were obliged to live into houses, and we were obliged to put back within houses what we used to experience within urban spaces, which was difficult, but which was in a way possible because of that, because of these very strange structures we built, which are very interesting structure from this point of view, because we forget that social media are virtual or digital spaces produced by a domestic imaginary. They are, in a way, a living room that allows us, for instance, Instagram or is a public place, or WhatsApp, for instance, is a sort of living room that allows me to live or to live together with at least 10 or 15 people I used to write to like every day. And we, in a way, through these tools, we built larger homes, or we have made a revolution into domestic space, in the sense that we are now living together with people that have nothing to do with our family, and in a way, we already freed the domestic space from the genealogical or family imagination of the 19th or 18th century. But we are, in a way, living a sort of schizophrenic opposition between the mineral houses, which are still built on this model of old
19th century or I don't know, 18th century family, and then this kind of digital houses, digital homes, through which we are already experimenting or experiencing a new way of being at home. Because in a way, even what we are doing now, I'm at home, so I'm doing what we normally could do outside our houses. So in the cities, we are doing that in our homes. That means that my home is now larger. It's really larger than it used to be. And that I'm living together because you are now in my living room. So you are now in my library. So we are living together through this digital space. What will happen? That's why I think houses are now, or homes are now changing their forms, and they are assuming on their shoulders a lot of features that used to belong to cities, and that's why we have to think again homes. Exactly because of, as you were saying, because we are living in homes where families are no more the hegemonic structure, and we have to adapt the architectural forms of homes to this new way of living, to this new need of domestic spaces which are larger and much more public in a way than earlier. Just a very short conclusion. This kind of different experience or kind of different balance of the relationship between homes and cities or public and private space is not just, how can I say, a technological question. It's really something very deep, which witnesses of a huge revolution in the very core idea of politics. So the modern idea of politics was the idea that cities, the public space, are a substance which is ontologically different from the domestic space. So nations are in opposition to the domestic space. The politics should be different from economy. The common is not the individual. We are now experiencing a very different idea since the 70s in a way. And for instance, what we call operaismo in Italy, it was also something like that. The idea that the common, the politics, is not something which is substantially different from the life of the multiplicity of individuals, but it's just a production of a group of individuals. And what we call platform economy is exactly that. In a way, Uber, Airbnb, they are all structured based on the fact that you can produce commonalities through private structure. Of course, in those cases, then these common space are again put in service of one individual, but we invented this very different idea of a common space produced by individual. And from this point of view, perhaps the most evident symbolic expression of this future revolution is Airbnb. Airbnb is, if you're looking at that, not from the point of view of economics or from the point of view of a Marxist critic, which is of course important, but from just as a symbolic form, Airbnb is something that produces the identity or the coincidence between the private sphere and the public sphere. So a home, so the ancient interior bourgeois of the 18th century becomes something which is public, where everybody can enter. So from this point of view, this is the coincidence we have to, in a way, think about for the next decades, I would say.
Well, we are borrowing each other's domesticities, as it were, whether through Airbnb or through the space that I see behind you and the space that you see behind me when we Zoom with each other. Emanuele, I do not want to consume your generosity and your intellect in one-to-one conversation, but I do want to suggest that at least with the few remaining minutes, we open it up to the public who's here. I don't know if anyone in this room has questions. Unfortunately, we cannot open it to the online public, but if anyone has a question here, there's a floating microphone that you can pick up and benefit from our friend Emanuele here and ask him questions. If not, we will let him go back to his domestic space. I see no hands, I see no questions. So, Emanuele, we love you.
I love you too.
And thank you so much for joining us and for
Thank you so
enriching
much.
the Biennale in so many ways. To be continued.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for coming. And as a reminder, we have another panel tomorrow afternoon, which is on the concept of play that cuts across many parts of the Biennale, from the Forte Marghera playground to the sports pavilion to the idea of play as it applies across board. Hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you very much. See you.